This is Harry Potter Read Aloud number 2. In the last time that we read, Harry and Ron were opening their Christmas presents that they got on Christmas morning. They both stayed at Hogwarts. His next present also contained candy, a large box of chocolate frogs from Hermione. This left only one parcel. Harry picked it up and felt it. It was very light. He unwrapped it. Something fluid and silvery gray went slithering to the floor where it lay in gleaming folds. Ron gasped. "I've heard of those," he said in a hushed voice, dropping the box of every flavor beans he'd gotten from Hermione. "If that's what I think it is, they're really rare and really valuable." "What is it?" Harry picked the shining silvery cloth off the floor. It was strange to the touch, like water woven into material. "It's an invisibility cloak," said Ron, a little look of awe on his face. "I'm sure it is. Try it on." Harry threw the cloak around his shoulders and Ron gave a yell. "It is! Look down!" Harry looked down at his feet, but they were gone. He dashed to the mirror. Sure enough, his reflection looked back at him, but just his head suspended in midair. His body was completely invisible. He pulled the cloak over his head and his reflection vanished completely. "There's a note," said Ron. A note fell out. Harry pulled off the cloak and seized the letter. Written in narrow, loopy writing he'd never seen before were the following words. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. A very Merry Christmas to you." There was no signature. Harry stared at the note. Ron was admiring the cloak. "I'd give anything for one of those," he said. "Anything. What's the matter?" "Nothing," said Harry. He felt very strange. Who had sent the cloak? Had it really once belonged to his father? Before he could say or think anything, the dormitory door was flung open and Fred and George Weasley bounded in. Harry stuffed the cloak quickly out of sight. He didn't feel like sharing it with anyone else yet. "Merry Christmas!" "Hey, look! Harry's got a Weasley sweater, too!" Fred and George were wearing blue ones with a large yellow F on it and the other a G. "Harry's is better than ours, though," said Fred, holding up Harry's sweater. "She obviously makes more of an effort if you're not family." "Why aren't you wearing yours, Ron?" George demanded. "Come on, get it on. They're lovely and warm." "I hate maroon," Ron moaned half-heartedly as he pulled it over his head. "You haven't got a letter on yours," George observed. "I suppose she thinks you don't forget your name. Well, we're not stupid. We know we're called Gred and Forge." "What's all this noise?" Percy stuck his head through the door, looking disapprovingly. He had clearly gotten halfway through unwrapping his presents, too, as he carried a lumpy sweater over his arm, which Fred seized. "P for prefect. Get it on, Percy. Come on, we're all wearing ours. Even Harry got one." "I don't want," said Percy thickly, as the twins forced the sweater over his head, knocking his glasses askew. "And you're not sitting with the prefects today either," said George. "Christmas is time for family." They frog-marched Percy from the room, his arms pinned to his side by the sweater. Harry had never in his life had such a Christmas dinner. 100 fat roast turkeys, mountains of roast and boiled potatoes, platters of chipolatas, tureens of buttered peas, silver boats of thick, rich gravy and cranberry sauce, and stacks of wizard crackers every few feet along the table. These fantastic party favors were nothing like the feeble muggle ones that the Dursleys usually bought, with their little plastic toys and flimsy paper hats inside. Harry pulled a wizard cracker with Fred, and it didn't just bang, it went off like a cannon and engulfed them in blue smoke, while from the inside exploded a rear admiral's hat and several live white mice. Up at the high table, Dumbledore had swapped his pointed wizard's hats for a flowered bonnet and was chucking merrily at a joke Professor Flitwick had just read him. Flaming Christmas puddings followed the turkey. Percy nearly broke his teeth on a silver sickle embedded in his slice. Harry watched Hagrid getting redder and redder in the face as he called for more. Finally, he kissed Professor McGonagall on the cheek, who, to Harry's amazement, giggled and blushed, her top hat lopsided. When Harry finally left the table, he was laden down with a stack of things out of the crackers, including a pack of non-explodable luminous balloons, a grow-your-own warts kit, and his own new wizard chess set. The white mice had disappeared, and Harry had a nasty feeling that they were going to end up in Mrs. Norris's Christmas dinner. Harry and the Weasleys spent a happy afternoon having a furious snowball fight on the grounds, and then, cold, wet, and gasping for breath, they returned to the fire in the Gryffindor common room, where Harry broke in his new chess set by losing spectacularly to Ron. He suspected he wouldn't have lost so bad if Percy hadn't tried to help him so much. After a meal of turkey sandwiches, crumpets, trifle, and Christmas cake, everyone felt too full and sleepy to do much before bed except sit and watch Percy chase Fred and George all over the Gryffindor Tower because they'd stolen his prefect badge. It had been Harry's best Christmas day yet. Something had been nagging at the back of his mind all day. Not until he climbed into bed was he free to think about it. The invisibility cloak and whoever had sent it. Ron, full of turkey and cake, said nothing, and with nothing mysterious to bother him, fell asleep almost as soon as he'd drawn the curtains of his bed. Harry leaned over the side of his own bed and pulled the cloak out from under it. His father's. This had been his father's. He let the material flow over his hands, smoother than silk, light as air. Use it well, the note had said. He had to try it now. He slipped out of the bed and wrapped the cloak around himself. Looking down at his legs, he saw only moonlight and shadows. It was a very funny feeling. Use it well. Suddenly, Harry felt wide awake. The whole of Hogwarts was open to him in this cloak. Excitement flooded through him as he stood there in the dark and silence. He could go anywhere in this, anywhere, and Filch would never know. Ron grunted in his sleep. Should Harry wake him? Something held him back. His father's cloak. He felt that this time, the first time, he wanted to use it alone. He crept out of the dormitory, down the stairs, across the common room, and climbed through the portrait hole. "Who's there?" squawked the fat lady. Harry said nothing. He walked quickly down the corridor. Where should he go? He stopped, his heart racing, and he thought. And then it came to him, the restricted section in the library. He'd be able to sit as long as he wanted to. He set off, drawing the invisibility cloak tighter around him as he walked. The library was pitch black and very eerie. Harry lit a lamp to see his way along the row of books. The lamp looked as though it were floating in midair, and even though Harry felt it on his arm, the sight gave him the creeps. The restricted section was right at the back of the library. Stepping carefully over the rope that separated these books from the rest of the library, he held up the lamp to read. The titles didn't tell him much. Their peeling, faded gold letters spelled words in languages Harry couldn't understand. Some had no title at all. One book had a dark stain on it that looked horribly like blood. The hairs on the back of Harry's neck prickled. Maybe he was imagining it, or maybe not, but he thought a faint whispering was coming from the books, as though they knew someone was there who shouldn't be. He had to start somewhere. Setting the lamp down, he looked along the bottom shelf for an interesting book. A large black and silver volume caught his eye. He pulled it out with difficulty because it was very heavy. Balancing on his knee, he let it fall open. A pierced, blood-curdling shriek split the silence. The book was screaming. Harry snapped it shut, but the shriek went on, one high, unbroken, ear-splitting note. He stumbled backward and knocked over his lamp, which went out at once. Panicking, he heard footsteps come down the corridor outside. Shuffling the shrieking book back onto the shelf, he ran for it. He passed Filch in the doorway. Filch's pale, wild eyes looked straight through him, and Harry slipped under Filch's arm and streaked off through the corridor, the book's shriek still ringing in his ears. He came to a halt in front of a tall suit of armor. He'd been so busy getting away from the library, he hadn't paid attention to where he was going. Perhaps because it was dark, he didn't recognize where he was at all. There was a suit of armor near the kitchens, he knew, but he must be 5 floors above there. You asked me to come directly to you, Professor, if someone was wandering around at night. Somebody's been in the library, the restricted section. Harry felt the blood drain out of his face. Wherever he was, Filch must know a shortcut because his soft, greasy voice was getting nearer, and to his horror, it was Snape who replied. The restricted section? Well, they can't be far. We'll catch them. Harry stood rooted to the spot as Filch and Snape came around the corner ahead. They couldn't see him, of course, but it was a narrow corridor, and if they came much closer, they'd knock right into him. The cloak couldn't stop him from being solid. He backed away as quickly as he could. A door stood ajar to his left. It was his only hope. He squeezed through it, holding his breath, trying not to move it, and to his relief, he managed to get inside the room without anyone noticing. They walked straight past, and Harry leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. It was a few seconds before he noticed anything about the room he had hidden in. It looked like an unused classroom. The dark shapes of desks and chairs were piled against the walls, and there was an upturned wastepaper basket, but propped against the wall facing him was something that didn't look as if it belonged there. Something that looked as if someone had just put it there to keep it out of the way. It was a magnificent mirror as high as the ceiling with an ornate gold frame. Standing on 2 clawed feet, there was an inscription underneath the top. Erised straw, eru oit, ube, kefru, oit on wosi. That doesn't make much sense to me, does it? That was kind of hard to read. his panic fading now that there was no sound of Filch and Snape. Harry moved nearer to the mirror, wanting to look at himself but seeing no reflection again. He stepped in front of it. He had to clap his hands to his mouth to stop himself from screaming. He whirled around, his heart pounding far more furiously, for he not only saw himself in the mirror, but a whole crowd of people standing right behind him. And the room was empty. Breathing very fast, he looked back to the mirror. There he was reflected in it, white and scared looking, and there reflected behind him were at least 10 others. Harry looked over his shoulder, but still no one was there. Or were they all invisible too? Was he, in fact, in a room full of invisible people? And this mirror's trick was that it reflected them? He looked in the mirror again. A woman was standing right behind his reflection, smiling and waving. He reached out a hand and felt the air behind him. If she was really there, he'd touch her. Their reflections were so close again. She was a very pretty woman. She had dark red hair, and her eyes are just like mine, Harry thought, edging a little closer. Bright green, exactly the same shape. And then he noticed that she was crying, smiling, but crying at the same time. The tall, thin, black-haired man standing next to her put his arm around her. He wore glasses and his hair was very untidy. It stuck up at the back, just as Harry's did. Harry was so close to the mirror now that his nose was nearly touching it. "Mum?" he whispered. "Dad?" They just stood looking at him, smiling, and slowly Harry looked at the faces of the other people. He saw pairs of green eyes like his and other noses like his, and even a little old man who looked as though he had Harry's knobbly knees. Harry was looking at his family for the first time in his life. The Potters smiled and waved at Harry, and he stared back at them, his hands pressed against the glass. How long he stood there he didn't know. The reflections did not fade, and he looked and looked until a distant noise brought him back to his senses. He couldn't stay here. He had to find his way back to bed. He tore his eyes away from his mother's face, whispered, "I'll come back," and then hurried from the room. "You could have woken me up," said Ron. "You can come tonight. I'm going back. I want to show you the mirror." "I'd like to see your mom and dad," Ron said eagerly. "And I want to see your family, all the Weasleys. You should be able to show me your older brothers and everyone." "You can see them any old time. Just come to my house at the summer. Anyway, maybe it only shows dead people. Shame about not finding Flamel, though. Have some bacon or something. Why aren't you eating?" Harry couldn't eat. He had seen his parents and would be seeing them again tonight. He'd almost forgotten about Flamel. It didn't seem important anymore. Who cared about the three-headed dog? What did it matter if Snape really stole something anyway? "Are you all right?" said Ron. "You look odd." What Harry feared most was what he might not be able to find with the mirror room again. With Ron covered in the cloak, too, they'd walked much more slowly the next night. "I'm freezing," said Ron. "Let's forget it and go back." "No," Harry said. "I know it's here somewhere." They passed the ghost of a tall witch gliding in the opposite direction, but saw no one else. Just as Ron started moaning that his feet were dead with cold, Harry spotted the suit of armor. "It's here, just here, yes." They pushed the door open. Harry dropped the cloak from his shoulders and ran to the mirror. There they were, his mother and father, beaming at the sight of him. "See?" Harry whispered. "I can't see anything." Look at them all. They're all here, loads of them." "I can only see you." "Look in it properly. Go ahead, stand where I am." Harry stepped aside with Ron in front of the mirror, and he couldn't see his family anymore, just Ron in his paisley pajamas. Ron, though, was staring transfixed at the image. "Look at me," he said. "Can you see all your family standing around you?" "No, I'm alone, but I'm different. I look older, and I'm a head boy." "What?" I'm wearing a badge like Bill used to, and I'm holding the house cup and the Quidditch cup. I'm Quidditch captain, too." Ron tore his eyes away from the splendid sight to look excitedly at Harry. "Do you think this mirror shows the future?" "How can it? All my family are dead. Let me have another look." "You had it to yourself all last night. Give me a bit more time." "You're only holding the Quidditch cup. What's interesting about that? I want to see my parents." "Don't push me." A sudden noise outside in the corridor put an end to their discussion. They hadn't realized how loudly they were talking. "Quick!" Ron threw the cloak back over them as the luminous eyes of Mrs. Norris came around the door. Ron and Harry stood quite still, both thinking the same thing. Did the cloak work on cats? After what had seemed an age, she turned and left. "This isn't safe. She might have gone for Filch. I bet she heard us. Come on." And Ron pulled Harry out of the room. The snow still hadn't melted the next morning. "Want to play chess, Harry?" said Ron. "No." "Why don't we go down and visit Hagrid?" "No, you go." "I know what you're thinking about, Harry, that mirror. Don't go back again tonight." "Why not?" "I don't know. I've got a bad feeling about it. And anyway, you've had too many close encounters already. Filch, Snape, Mrs. Norris, all wandering around. So what if they can't see you? What if they walk into you? And what if you knock something over?" You sound like Hermione. I'm serious, Harry. Don't go. But Harry had only one thought in his head, which was to get back in front of the mirror, which Ron wasn't going to stop him. And that's where we're going to stop video number 2. I miss you guys.